The afternoon light pressed low over the lake, a soft golden sheet that turned the water into hammered brass and drew long tree shadows across the gravel lane. The house stood quiet against the bank, cedar siding weathered to a silvery grain, a deep porch hewn from old beams, and windows that had learned the seasons, like a set of lungs, learning to breathe. The place smelled faintly of cut pine, damp rope, and the mineral bite of shoreline stone. It had been built for peace, and for years that was all it knew. Peace ended the day. Rumor turned into paperwork, and paperwork turned into a clamor of feet on boards. It started small, as these things do. A note on the community bulletin insisting that detached boathouses were a blight. A neighbor's complaint about the angle of a dock. A question, sharpened by jealousy, about how a man afforded an acre of water and sky. Soon the lake carried words like driftwood. Rough, splintered, heavy with other people's imaginations. Karen's name rose among them, buoyed by position and persistence. She liked minutes, motions, and morale. Liked the taste of words that sounded like law even when they were only noise. She was the sort of person who believed a rule should arrive like weather, uninvited, impartial, and impossible to argue with. The sheriff of this county, owner of the quiet house with cedar siding and hammer-smooth water, had learned long ago that power speaks most clearly when it doesn't need to raise its voice. But he also knew how quickly certain voices learned to shout when they mistook patience for permission. He had chosen this place because the lake's musculature calmed his own, because a porch swing can turn an hour into a cure, because a tree line can hush a year's worth of sirens. He did not choose it to make a point. And yet somehow it had become a point anyway. The afternoon he returned from town, a strange geometry had overtaken his shoreline. Folding chairs sprouted like pale mushrooms at the property's edge. Phones glinted. The HOA board sandwich board sign, pompous as a parade, leaned against a birch, declaring a compliance review in letters that tried too hard. Karen stood with a binder heavy enough to break the spine of better causes, her stance pitched forward with the impatience of someone who believes the world moves too slowly when it does not move for her. The sheriff set his keys on the porch rail and took in the arrangement. The dock extended 22 feet, square at the end, bolted through the deck boards to steel brackets set before his time. The boathouse wore its age like a linen shirt, creased, honest, breathable. A kayak lay sun-tired on sawhorses. The lawn sloped gentle to water that was already borrowing evening light. None of it had changed since deeds were read and signatures dried. Only the tone had changed. The town's oldest resource and its most fragile. He understood, clinically at first, what was assembling. A crisis without emergency. A crowd without curiosity. Verdict without evidence. It was the kind of spectacle that grows from the cheap fertilizer of certainty. He had seen it in parking lots after fender benders, at fairgrounds when mud made tempers slip, in kitchens where old resentment simmered with the stew. He recognized the choreography. Karen pointed to a sheet of bylaws printed last quarter. When the board had floated amendments during low attendance and high boredom, she believed her papers made the lake new, and therefore his house non-compliant, and therefore his presence negotiable. The sheriff had spent a career watching noise pretend to be authority. He also knew the geometry of escalation, the angle of a crowd, the way phones become armor, the way a person hardens when watched. He felt the lake breeze push across his forearms and let his breath match it. He read faces quickly, the way professionals do. The watchers wanted a story they could repeat to other porches. The timid wanted permission to stay timid. A handful wanted fairness, but fairness looked slow beside performance. Beyond them, geese moved in the far shallows like a string of black commas, pausing the sentence of the day. A fisherman skated past in a john boat, oars tapping an easy syllable against wood. Nature kept its grammar even when people did not. It was almost funny the way a crowd will invent urgency under a sky that refuses to care. Karen stepped nearer to the property line, the invisible border people love to worship when they are trying to sanctify their mood. She raised her binder as if it could shade her from a truth she did not like. then called across the space between them with the bravado of a stage cue. The sheriff didn't move. He did not answer. He simply looked past her to the sign she had planted. A review, a ceremony, a small court without jurisdiction. He had been to enough real courts to recognize when cosplay tried to take their place. Around the corner of the porch, the station radio he kept for bad days gave a faint thrum. The habit of a lifetime insisted he know where the other emergencies were. The habit of a homeowner insisted he assess the one on his lawn. He considered the leverage points. The survey stakes that slept under soil and memory. State lakefront statutes that outranked the fanciest laminated HOA rule set. He could stack those facts like a quiet fortress. But he knew a fortress only invites siege when onlookers crave a battle. What interested him was the thing under the thing, the insecurity that breathes through control, the loneliness that drapes itself in procedure, the envy that pretends to be improvement. On cue, a phone lit and fingers danced across a screen. The sheriff thought of how easily a crowd soars a version of the truth before the truth arrives. And then, sharp as a tapped glass, came the pitch of sirens in the distance. Thin at first, then strengthening, a silver wire pulling through cloth. Someone had called the number people. Imagine is a wand. Someone had summoned spectacle with the confidence of a child pressing a button. He did not need to guess who. Sirens drew the crowd closer to itself, shoulders tucked, chins lifted. Every witness rehearsed their lines in private. The sheriff glanced at the lake one more time, at the stubborn, smoothing patience of water, at clouds that had made a queen's robe of the horizon. He felt the old resolve settle into him like a coin falling into an old slot. The one that says wait. The one that says count to 30, while others count their outrage. The one that says let the room reveal itself. He did not go to his truck for a badge or a hat or a practiced voice. He did not intend to flash authority like a trick. He intended to let the afternoon explain the difference between law and theater. The sirens slid down to a hush as patrol cars eased along the lane, crunching gravel that had known his own tires for years. Blue lights flickered against birch trunks and porch beams, turning the lake's gold to winter steel. Officers stepped out with the caution of people who had learned that nothing is simple where spectators assemble. He knew each posture, each scan, each resting hand near a belt, each calculation about angles and exits. He had taught some of it. He had learned some of it the hard way, and written the rest in reports that tried not to bleed. Karen straightened, binder clutched at chest height, the way a person holds proof when their confidence is rented. The crowd arranged itself into a shape that looked like righteousness. If you didn't squint, phones rose, throats cleared. Somewhere a neighbor tried to look both brave and blameless. The sheriff didn't move from his porch rail. He stayed inside the quiet he had practiced his entire adult life, the kind of quiet that lets other people reveal what they came to say. He thought of the morning the boathouse had been repaired. Old nails had been coaxed out of board that felt like brothers, a slow rediscovery of joints and angles. The carpenter had laughed at how stubborn wood becomes when it's been honest for decades. The sheriff liked honest stubbornness. He liked things that didn't give, because someone with a form letter asked it to. He liked this house precisely because it was not an argument. It was a belonging. The first officer on scene set his boots at the property edge, and the lake delivered a breeze that smelled of reed and thyme. He scanned faces, let his gaze land on the sign, the binder, the phones, the sheriff's plain stance. The second officer tracked the line from porch to dock to water, measuring distance like a mapmaker. Somewhere to the side, a child asked a soft question of a parent who shushed them with that peculiar intensity. Adults reserve for moments they have decided are important. Even the birds held their grammar. The sheriff studied the crowd, the way a doctor studies posture, the way a carpenter studies the direction a board wishes to bend. He saw fear disguised as order, envy disguised as aesthetics, boredom disguised as civic duty. He saw the brittle brightness in Karen's eyes, a shine that comes when a person believes victory will fix something nothing else has fixed. He felt, rather than decided, that this encounter would bend in two directions at once, toward the paperwork she believed made her strong, and toward the revelation that would make her small. He did not plan to humiliate her. He did not plan to win. He planned to let the truth take up as much space as the lake would lend it. That is the advantage of a county's memory. It is wide, older than the newest rule, older than the people who make it ringing, and new. He allowed his breath to settle into the same rhythm as the water tapping against the pilings. The day was not in a hurry. He would refuse to be too. The moment before the first words mattered most. It always did. That hinge decides whether a day becomes a charge or a lesson. He marked it the way he once marked thresholds at a crime scene, knowing that some crossings are invisible and irreversible. He understood the performance Karen had staged and the ending she expected. An ending with a homeowner chastened and a crowd satisfied by the clean theater of removal. He understood, too, the difference between what authority looks like and what it is. In that stretched electric silence, siren spent, lake breathing, crowd leaning, the story asked for its shape. The sheriff let it come. He stepped forward one measured pace, not to impose, not to announce, but to inhabit the place that was his. The boards beneath his boots answered with a sound older than the bylaws in Karen's binder. The house settled with him, a shared vertebra, clicking back into place. The afternoon lowered itself another notch and gilded the edges of everything that still belonged. The next move awaited, and with it the long unwinding of a community's certainty. The first chapter of a conflict often ends like this, not with a word but with a held breath. On the lake, a fish broke surface, stitched the gold with a momentary wound, then vanished. Ripples widened, lost their sharpness, and joined the rest of the water. The crowd shifted. The officers read the weather of faces, and the sheriff, who owned both the deed to this place and the trust of a county, prepared to let the meeting become a mirror. Karen had made her call. The county had answered. The lake kept time. The lesson would begin. Before a binder appears, a story grows its roots in soil no one bothered to test. Long before the sign leaned against the birch, before officers' boots found the property line, the lake community had been rehearsing its unrest. It rehearsed it at HOA breakfasts where muffins sopped up grievances, at evening walks where measurements of deck width masqueraded as neighborliness, at holiday boat parades where money disguised itself in tasteful bunting. In such places, an old truth worked like a submerged stump. What people resent in others is usually a shape they cannot find in themselves. The sheriff had seen that truth break hulls. He bought the lake house after a decade of nights spent in other people's emergencies. He bought it the way a worn joint chooses a gentler gait. The place had belonged to a widower who sanded his fears into furniture and left behind a workbench still perfumed with sawdust. Its deed predated the HOA and therefore stood like a granite outcrop in a sea of newly printed rules. That was never meant to be a challenge. It simply meant the house kept a different clock. The dock's length had been measured against storms, not bylaws. The boathouse had been squared to wind, not committees. The porch had been tuned to the key of loons at dusk, not to the pitch of annual meetings. When the sheriff moved in, he brought quiet with him. Quiet is an interesting kind of neighbor. It is either a balm or an insult, depending on what a person believes attention is for. For some, his steady routines, his early runs along the lane, his habit of waving once and then going about his business, made the community feel safer. For others, his self-sufficiency felt like a snub they could not quite name. In a small place, narrative loves an empty space. People fill it with whatever helps them sleep. Karen had arrived 2 summers earlier with furniture that looked like credibility and a smile trained for committees. She believed in order because chaos had once taken something from her. What exactly, no one knew, but her fervor suggested a debt she intended to collect from the universe. She mapped the neighborhood with a meticulousness that would have impressed a surveyor, marking the exact places where other people's choices crossed her sense of rightness. The sheriff watched her organize kindness into campaigns and campaigns into mandates. He recognized the appetite. He recognized the loneliness that rode inside it like a passenger that never paid fare. Underlying the polished language of improvement were the softer materials. Envy of a lake view wider than hers. Suspicion of a man who did not need a crowd. discomfort with the idea that someone could own history older than a binder. When the board brought up amendments, attendance was light. When the board announced their passage, applause was loud. Because people are braver about cheering what is already decided. The new rules wore the scent of progressive tightness, standardized dock lengths, uniform boathouse materials. Height limits justified as sightline preservation. None were wicked. All were blunt. The sheriff compared the amendments to his deed and saw the inevitable collision. He could have gone to the meeting with case law and diagrams. He could have asked for a carve-out already granted by time. Instead, he did nothing, not from arrogance, but from a belief that calm is as instructive as correction. He assumed that the board, when faced with the age of the documents and the geography of the shoreline, would adjust like sensible sailors. He underestimated the human need to prove a point when the audience is watching. Meanwhile, the county's burdens did not shrink to accommodate neighborhood theater. Opioids continued their slow theft in back roads and quiet kitchens. Old timber bridges kept a ledger of years that could not be paid without a bond. Families made frail truces at custody exchanges in the courthouse parking lot. The sheriff's inbox collected more hurt than righteous indignation ever exists. On nights when the scanner hissed with overlapping calls, he drove past the lake and let the house anchor his morale. He learned again and again that work is about the worst people do, and home should be the best place survives. Karen's campaign gathered steam across small damages. A child's lost soccer ball in her hostess became a parable about discipline. A neighbor's work truck parked crooked for 7 minutes became a speech about standards. She felt most alive when defining a line. Some lines protect, others separate people from their better selves. The sheriff watched, rationing his interventions to those moments where safety, not preference, hung in the balance. He yielded the rest to the lake's patience, hoping the water would teach what he could not instruct without becoming what she already imagined him to be. What no one called by its proper name was class. Lake houses are complicated money. Sometimes old, sometimes new, sometimes hard-earned, sometimes leveraged, often misunderstood. The sheriff's house looked like restraint beside newer places. It read like heritage to people who valued that code, and like privilege to those who hated all codes but their own. He did not correct their readings. He knew that telling people they are misreading a story only makes them underline the parts they prefer. The first formal letter arrived in late spring, printed on thick paper that imagined itself as legitimacy. It used terms like non-compliance and remediation. It offered deadlines the way the weather offers rain. The sheriff read it at the porch table while the lake wore white caps. He marked the passages that confused HOA scope with zoning authority, set the letter under a whiskey glass to flatten its curl, and let it sit there as a still life of a town arguing with itself. He planned a measured response built of statutes and recorded easements. Then a fatal crash on Route 9 turned his week into a corridor of grief notifications, and the letter sat, patient beneath the glass. A minor storm that could wait. It did not wait for Karen. Patience irritated her the way a loose thread irritates a seamstress. Proof something is unfinished. She sent a second notice, then a third, each tightening the tone the way a singer tightens a throat to reach a note that doesn't suit their range. By midsummer, she had convinced herself that ignoring letters was a moral wrong, that the sheriff's quiet was contempt rather than triage. She gathered the board and framed the issue as a test of will more than a test of jurisdiction. A crowd loves a test of will. It's easier to judge than research. Behind the performance, the sheriff's private ledger kept another list. The widow on Birch Lane who refused a restraining order because paper cannot stand between a body and a door. The teenager who found trouble where his father's absence left air. The deputy who hid his exhaustion under jokes until none of the jokes were funny. These were the things the badge weighed. Against them, a dock length measured by the nostalgia of a new board felt small. And yet he knew from experience that small things can erode trust, like water finds a seam in stone. He also knew there was danger in letting a petty conflict ripen to a public spectacle. Publicness adds pressure, and pressure pushes people into corners they would not choose in private. It makes apologies feel like surrender and compromises look like defeat. He had seen small disputes burn barns once they met oxygen. He wondered if he should have moved sooner. spared the crowd its appetite by ending the matter with a single letter and a single citation. The kind that teaches an HOA where its fences stop. But there was a principle he cherished more than the efficiency of a correction. Communities learn best from the mirror of their own behavior. Karen's mirror told her she was a guardian against decline. The crowd's mirror told them they were stewards of property values and therefore of virtue. The sheriff's mirror told him he was tired of being the lesson, and still he let the day come. The one where a sign leaned on birch bark and officers' boots bit gravel, because he trusted that sunlight and the wide grammar of the lake could do a kind of teaching no memo could. Beneath all of it ran the slow current of his own history with the place. He had first seen the cedar siding on a winter afternoon when the lake was a single sheet of pewter and the sky a stern teacher. The widower had shown him the workshop and the beam initials carved by a hand impatient with grief. The sheriff had placed his palm on the carved letters and felt a transfer of weight. One man setting down loneliness, another picking up a refuge. He promised the house that day he would be a good caretaker. Caretaking requires boundaries the way a shoreline requires stone. It also requires gentleness with people who don't know where their fear is coming from. He practiced both, then and now. By the week of the so-called compliance review, neighbors had chosen sides without quite understanding the map. The ones who respected the sheriff's service used their respect like an amulet, certain it would guard against embarrassment. The ones who envied the house used their envy like a lens, magnifying small defects into offenses. The ones who simply wanted to fish in peace wished all of it would sink. And Karen, convinced that a moment had arrived in which she could finally prove that rules mean more than the people who preceded them, dialed a number she believed would turn a private unease into a public victory. When sirens announced themselves to the lane and blue light braided the birch trunks, the underlying struggles rose to the surface like startled carp. This was not just about a dock, it was about a county learning again the difference between appetite and authority, between order and control, between the noise of certainty and the quiet of stewardship. The sheriff felt the weight of those distinctions settle across his shoulders as the officers took their positions and the crowd squared itself into witnesses. A story only becomes a lesson if someone is willing to let the ending be different than the opening demands. He intended to hold that possibility open as long as the lake's breath allowed. The moment after arrival settled into a kind of suspended weather. Blue light throbbed against tree bark and porch posts, and the crowd calibrated itself to the presence of uniforms. The way a flock reforms after a hawk's shadow slides over it. The sheriff could feel the practiced calm of the officers inch outward, a quiet perimeter that discouraged sharp edges. That calm had once been his to cast. Now he stood inside it like any other resident who needed the day to remember what it was about. Across the lane, a girl in a sun-faded sweatshirt clutched a leash as her beagle worried a tuft of grass. She looked toward the porch with the half-formed concern of someone learning the scale of adult conflict. Her mother's hand rested on her shoulder, not to restrain, but to anchor. The sheriff recognized the posture. He had seen it outside courtrooms and in ER corridors and on school steps after fire drills. The impulse to steady a child with touch was the simplest kind of policing, and the most enduring. He breathed in once more, slow, and let his attention move like water around stones, touching faces without clinging, noting every small bridge that might carry the afternoon from spectacle back to sense. A deputy he had trained years earlier stood near the HOA sign, scanning in deliberate arcs, eyes landing on the porch and lifting. Not with surprise, but with the mental adjustment any professional makes when a set of facts rearranges itself. The deputy's hands rested low, relaxed, a sign of competence rather than laxness. Their shared history: midnight crash scenes, lost hikers found with hoarse cheers, winter mornings when diesel wouldn't turn over without coaxing, made its own invisible line between them. The sheriff felt both older and lighter seeing this young man's steadiness. Whatever else happened, the county had not forgotten how to send good people to do hard things. On the water a loon called, the long, hollow sound that makes even the confident become thoughtful. It unstitched some of the crowd's bravado, just a seam or two, enough to let reflection leak in. The sheriff allowed himself a private ledger of gratitude. For birds indifferent to bylaws, for boards that remembered the weight of his boots, for neighbors who had learned to bring casseroles without asking questions. Gratitude is a bridge, too, and sturdier than most protests. He considered Karen, not the binder or the sign or the posture, but the woman beneath the performance. Her arrival 2 summers back had come with rumor that sounded like sympathy smuggled inside gossip. A late divorce, a house sold quickly in another county, a job that applauded her precision and then downsized it away. She had rebuilt herself out of routines. She had stitched her certainty from lists and laminated minutes. A person so assembled can feel threatened by any place that will not fold into their neatness. He had seen it in new deputies who clung to policy like a raft until they learned how to swim inside it. He had seen it in himself when he first took the badge, the way procedure kept fear from speaking too loudly. Fear, contained, can become service. Fear, disguised, becomes rulemaking. He did not excuse her call. He looked instead for the path that would leave her dignity intact, while still telling the truth about limits. He knew from long practice that a public climb down leaves scars. A private concession becomes a lesson. But the hour was already public. The blue lights already braided into birch and cedar. The crowd already a jury seeking a narrative with the satisfying click of judgment. So he searched for other bridges, moments of recognition, shared history, the humbler facts that rehumanize everyone in view. One such fact stood 3 yards off the porch. A neighbor who ran the bait shop where county workers cashed paychecks and bought coffee in thick-lipped cups. The bait shop owner had loaned the sheriff a generator during an ice storm, and refused payment later with the stubborn grace of people who do not count favors because they intend to keep them in circulation. That man's presence now, arms folded but eyes soft, was a kind of vote, not for the sheriff personally, but for the possibility that this would end without anyone needing to be an example. Another bridge lay inside the paper in Karen's binder. Even in their overreach, the amendments had been fretted by neighbors who believed they were stewarding beauty. The sheriff could honor the impulse even as he corrected the authority. He had learned that when you name the part of a person's effort that is good, you loosen the grip of the part that is harmful. In this way, you lead them back to themselves without forcing them to admit they were lost. He thought of the widower who built the workbench in the shop. The slow, patient sanding that made even scrap look like intention. That man had taught the sheriff with no words at all, that to care for a place is to move at the speed of its materials. Cedar demands slowness. Shorelines demand respect for their own geometry. Communities demand that you hold your breath a second longer than feels comfortable, so someone else can exhale. Those teachings hung about the porch like the smell of sap. A quiet curriculum that had nothing to do with emergency lights and everything to do with staying. Memory offered another plank. Not long after he bought the house, before anyone associated the porch with his job. An older couple in a listing. John boat had drifted toward the shallows in a sudden wind. He had waded out thigh-deep, boots heavy, and steadied the bow while they found their stroke and their nerve again. The story had traveled around the lake in a loose, affectionate way that placed him inside the community before the badge tried to do it for him. Those old currents still ran. The couple wasn't here today. They spent late summers with grandchildren. But their absence carried presence. Someone in this crowd had heard that story from someone else and would remember it as they watched this new story unfold. In small counties, kindness becomes an infrastructure as real as culverts and bridges. Wind teased the HOA sign, flipping one corner up and slapping it back in the rhythm of an intention foot. The sheriff studied the officers' faces, listening to the professional calculus he could read there without hearing a word. The jurisdictional map, the civil versus criminal divide, the property rights that circumscribe all but the smallest subset of trespass calls. He knew what they would find when they placed the deed beside the amendments. He knew what the state statute would say about older easements and the limits of association authority. But those facts needed an on-ramp that didn't shear egos as it merged. He let his gaze return to Karen. Beneath the performance, he saw exhaustion etched around the eyes, a brittle shine that often precedes regret. He had seen that look in plaintiffs after verdicts that brought no relief. and complainants who mistook the machinery of process for a bomb. Sometimes people push conflict forward because they cannot imagine who they are without it. Sometimes they need someone else to imagine it for them. This job, even off-duty, kept asking the same favor: hold a better picture steady until someone else can see it. A small boat glided closer to the dock's outer edge, its oarlocks ticking like a metronome for patience. The fisherman lifted 2 fingers from the handle in an old laconic salute that recognized the house more than the man. It was the kind of quiet acknowledgement that binds rural places together. Nothing to do with office, everything to do with presence. The sheriff nodded back without weight. Not every bond needs to announce itself to be binding. At the edge of the lawn, a boy on a bicycle coasted down the slope until the front tire hissed the property line, and then he stopped, newly aware of invisible thresholds made visible by adults. He stared at the porch with a curiosity unpolluted by any theory of HOA governance. The sheriff felt an unexpected responsibility to that gaze. However this ended, the boy would take away a lesson about what uniforms are for and what neighbors owe each other when rules knock too loudly. Children collect these lessons like stones. They skip them across later arguments, watching which ones throw the farthest ring. The sheriff's attention returned to the badge, not the object in his drawer, but the idea he had been trying to carry well. Authority, when it behaves, is a service that makes itself smaller so the world can be larger for everyone else. Authority, when it performs, is a costume that eats all the oxygen. Today he could do damage by winning too obviously. He could also do damage by pretending there was nothing to correct. The middle way was narrow. Acknowledge the crowd's worry about order, honor the board's desire for coherence, affirm the officer's professionalism, and still draw a line firm enough to keep future afternoons from being conscripted into theater. He pictured the letter still flattened beneath the whiskey glass on the porch table. He considered lifting it, bringing it into view, making the simple case that time and law outranked the newest appetite for symmetry. He considered pointing to the steel bracket set before the HOA Incorporated, to the survey stakes that traced the historical arc of shoreline use, to the precedent cases he could cite from memory, if he let himself. But he also remembered how quickly proofs become humiliation when the audience wants a different genre. Better, perhaps, to let the officers build the bridge, to stand not as the engineer but as the weight that tests the span once it's laid. He let his shoulders lower a fraction. He angled his stance not toward Karen, not toward the officers, but toward the water, as if to invite the afternoon itself to arbitrate. He had used the lake this way before, as a shared reference that draws people out of their carapaces. A shoreline is an old teacher. It smooths whatever scrapes along it often enough. If the crowd would not listen to a man, perhaps they would listen to a place. The murmurs that had been kept on a low simmer began to cool. Someone cleared a throat and then decided not to speak. Someone else shifted from a stance of accusation to a stance of fatigue. The bait shop owner uncrossed his arms. The girl with the beagle loosened her grip. The boy on the bicycle put one foot to the ground. None of these were conclusions. All of them were invitations. The sheriff took inventory of the entire small world. The officers, the sign, the binder, the phones, the neighbors, the water. What he wanted most was not vindication. It was the return of an ordinary evening, the hiss of a skillet, the clink of ice, the small blessing of shoes left by the door. He wanted the crowd to redissolve into neighbors who yelled warnings about storms and shared lawn tools and returned ladders on time. He wanted Karen to walk away with enough of herself intact to try again later in a smaller way, maybe with a baked good committee that would let her precision bless people instead of organizing their resentment. He wanted the officers to leave with the clean relief of a call correctly handled. He wanted the boy on the bicycle to believe, at least for a while, that grown-ups could be trusted with their own noise. He did not control those outcomes. He could only select the next right action and place it on the table like a piece of bread. He selected stillness. He let the deputy he had trained take the first formal approach. He allowed the space to fill with process that was not theater, but craft, a profession doing what it does when it remembers itself. In yielding that first move, he laid down another plank of the bridge he needed. Everyone to cross, from adversarial hunger to communal sense. As the deputy began his careful, neutral work, the sheriff's mind touched briefly on the history that made all of this more than an HOA scuffle. His father had taught in a one-room schoolhouse a county over, a place where discipline consisted mostly of convincing children that work was a shape their lives could take. His mother had run a ledger at the diner where harvests were tallied in pancakes and bad years forgiven with coffee refills. He had learned early that authority without kindness is brittle, and kindness without boundaries is mush. Between those two communities walk a beam. He had chosen the badge because the beam needed walking, and chosen the lake house because walkers need somewhere level to stand when the balance trembles. A dragonfly stitched silver threads in the air above the dock. The sun eased down another degree, gilding the wet edges of stones. The county breathed with him. He felt the possibility take on a little weight, the way a bridge feels the first footfall, and hums a note of its own integrity. Karen shifted her binder from one arm to the other. The crowd's phones dipped a few inches, lenses no longer certain. The picture would flatter their outrage. The officer's attention stayed steady, but the stiff edge of readiness softened by a hair. The sheriff stood inside that softening and let it spread. He knew that Chapter 4 of any such day, the public challenge, the climb and the brink, would still arrive. Half of the crowd had come for it and would be disappointed without it. But he also knew that when emotional bridges are laid early, the later crossing is quieter, the stakes smaller, the landing safer. He imagined, just for a moment, the conclusion he wanted. A porch light flicked on against dusk. A sign folded and put away. A binder closed without the brittle crack of a lost battle. The sound of water resuming its unremarkable labor of smoothing what is jagged. He would still have to speak. He would still have to let the truth be as unembarrassed as the lake. But the speaking could now land on something other than the steel of a dare. It could land on wood that remembered honest work. On neighbors reminded, however briefly, that they were not spectators, but participants in a place worth more than a rule. On officers whose report would read like the small victory that it was. On a woman who might yet learn that belonging is not achieved by tightening everything that moves, but by noticing what holds without being forced. The day paused, inhaled, and held. The bridge vibrated with a living weight. Somewhere a screen door clicked 2 lots down. The domestic syllable of a life going on. The county, fragile and resilient, waited to see whether it could cross. The afternoon shifted from expectant to adversarial, the way a sky hardens before a storm. The arrival had drained curiosity and filled the space with posture. Uniforms drew lines without drawing weapons. Neighbors repositioned themselves for vantage points that felt like participation. Phones rose again, steadier now, their lenses rehearsing victory. What had felt briefly like a community remembering itself grew tight with performance. Procedure began its quiet march. The deputy he had trained stepped forward, not toward the man on the porch, but toward the paper that claimed authority. He requested the document with the neutral courtesy of a craftsman reaching for a tool. Karen offered the binder with a practiced lift of the chin, her body speaking a verdict before any process could. Plastic sleeves flashed in the sun as she opened to the tabs she had color-coded for this very moment. The section headings wore the confidence of new ink. The bullet points arranged themselves like soldiers who had never seen a field. The sheriff watched the small theater unfold with the calm of someone who had paced 100 such stages. In disputes like these, the front row always believes the script is short. Yet real resolution, he knew, respected the long grammar of place and law. He let the deputy let the seconds gather. He let the crowd fill those seconds with meaning of their own. The deputy moved with care, eyes tracking paragraphs, finger marking lines that sounded like declarations until jurisdiction trimmed them down to size. He asked for the dates of adoption, and Karen produced them with a confidence that imagined finality. He asked whether the amendments had been filed with the county, and a flicker crossed her face, brief, almost private, before she recovered into certainty. The HOA sign clicked against the birch again, metronoming her impatience. Around the circle, neighbors shifted like a chorus, leaning into a crescendo they believed would arrive on cue. A second officer separated from the group and angled toward the porch. The motion was deliberate and slow, not hunting for conflict, but closing distance with the respect a professional offers to anyone who might reasonably claim a boundary. The sheriff remained still, hands visible, posture neither slouched nor squared. He had taught this posture to recruits, the stance that neither invites nor resists, that allows the other person to bring their best self forward by giving them no excuse to bring their worst. Dispatch murmured over the radio in the officer's shoulder mic, a thin thread of county noise that wove through the afternoon's larger fabric. The sheriff knew the cadence by heart. Incident numbers, cross streets, united acknowledgments. A voice reading out the file copy of an address whose living copy stood right here in Cedar and Light. The officer's gaze touched the porch briefly with the look of someone receiving new information and storing it. For now, behind the curtain of process, the revelation would have its hour. He resisted the easy rescue of naming it. Timing is the difference between instruction and humiliation. Karen pressed her advantage, such as she believed it to be. The board members behind her nodded in tight, reinforcing rhythms. Their faces wore the moral relief of people who have found a rule strong enough to carry feelings they could not name. One neighbor, emboldened by numbers, edged closer to the lawn as if proximity could confer jurisdiction. Another filmed with a solemnity that treated the lens as truth, forgetting how often lenses are merely mirrors for whatever story the holder came to prove. The deputy finished with the binder and lifted his attention to the wider map, deed, survey, statute. He asked again with the same neutral craft for the property documents. The sheriff turned, slow and ordinary, and reached for the envelope he had placed years ago in the drawer of the porch table. He had always kept it there, not as a dare, but as an act of respect for the place he loved. A house deserves its papers close by in case history needs to speak for itself. He set the envelope on the rail between them, then stepped back, leaving it to be opened by hands other than his. Even a correct fact lands softer when someone else discovers it. The deputy withdrew the deed, and the accompanying survey, paper creaking softly at the folds. Here were dates with the patina of years. Here were signatures that carried the modest authority of people who had put their names to a thing without imagining they were writing a script for a future crowd. Here were easements that spoke in the oldest language of property, measured lengths, bearing angles, fixed markers hammered into soil when the lake was younger. And committees were still a notion. The deputy read with that particular stillness that comes when a person recognizes the outline of the answer beginning to resolve. Tension rippled through the onlookers and counterpoint. Those who had come for spectacle felt it teetering. Those who had come for fairness felt something like relief threatening to break cover. Those who steeled themselves against disappointment tightened their expressions to keep it out. The boy on the bicycle held the frame between his knees like a question. The girl with the beagle bent to scratch its ears, a quiet kindness that made a better shape in the air. Karen read the deputy's silence as resistance and marshaled a fresh prop. Printed photographs of other docs trimmed to the new standard. Examples of obedience framed as virtue. She held them up to the crowd as if to gather a second verdict while the first was still being written. The sheriff recognized the strategy. When facts lose ground, performance goes louder. He also recognized the risk. Volume loves to recruit bystanders who didn't intend to vote. He remained still, letting the officer's professionalism cast shade over the hottest corners. The second officer conferred briefly with the first, an exchange of small nods and clipped quiet signals. Their attention returned, not to the crowd, but to the documents. The deputy traced a finger down a statute number printed at the bottom margin, a reference to state law that outranked any neighborhood enthusiasm. He had the look of someone finding bedrock beneath a soft field. That look is a pivot. It asks for care in how the next step lands. The public challenge crested. A neighbor asked, in the tone of someone wrapping their fear in civic concern, whether failure to enforce rules would lead to decline. Another wondered aloud if exceptions today would turn into chaos tomorrow. The phrases were familiar. Every county had versions, paced to the metronome of property values and nostalgia. The sheriff felt the gravity of those worries without yielding to the conclusions they demanded. Order matters, but order misapplied becomes control, and control mistaken for community. starves the very thing it claims to protect. The deputy turned a page and found the clause that mattered. Language acknowledging pre-existing structures and recorded easements. Language that had been written by a lawyer who understood that time itself is a stakeholder. The officer's shoulders lowered a fraction as comprehension settled. He glanced once more toward the porch, then back to the binder, then to the faces that waited for a ruling, dressed as a removal. He prepared the shape of his explanation, the one that would honor everyone's best intention while laying a boundary firm enough to hold. Before he could speak, the afternoon offered one more strain of tension. A latecomer strode up the lane with the bustle of someone who loves the tail end of a crisis, because it still smells like beginning. He carried a portable speaker under his arm and announced his presence with gestures designed to seat a second crowd within the first. The officer nearest the sign repositioned a small practiced adjustment that settled the space without scolding it. Pressure is elastic until it isn't. Professionals learn to keep it within its stretch. The sheriff felt the pull to end it, to spare the deputy the tightrope, to reveal the badge outright and let its weight realign the scene. He resisted, not out of coyness, but out of respect for process, and for the deputy's authorship of the moment. When officers get to finish the work they start, their confidence grows in the right direction. The county benefits long after the blue lights have gone. He held steady and left the revelation to the page, and the voice that had earned the right to read it. Karen's binder hovered at her chest again, more shield now than text. Her eyes flicked from document to deputy to crowd, calculating loss in real time and groping for some remaining high ground. He recognized the cliff edge she stood upon, the one that drops into anger when certainty finds bedrock in the wrong place. He also recognized the narrow path that runs along that cliff, the one that allows a person to climb down with dignity if someone steadies the rope. The deputy could steady it. The sheriff could too, by refusing to gloat when gravity took its quiet turn. A gust came off the water and moved through the trees in a low, even word. The whole shoreline understood. The light thinned another shade toward evening. The bait shop owner unfolded his arms and let his hands fall open at his sides, as if to say he was ready for ordinary again. The boy on the bicycle pressed one foot to the ground and steadied the wheel. Even the latecomer with the speaker seemed to absorb the shift and quiet his gestures by a degree. It was as if the place itself had chosen the outcome and was now waiting for the humans to catch up. The deputy lifted his head. He had gathered the documents into an order that told a story. Deed first, survey next, statute last. He stepped slightly, so that both Karen and the crowd could see the pages as he spoke. Not to humiliate, but to include. His tone carried the balanced cadence of someone who believed in civility as a form of strength. He began to explain how jurisdictions nest, how newer rules recognize older rights, how associations manage many things but not all things, how recorded history outvotes recent appetite when the two sit at the same table. He took care to praise the board's intent to maintain beauty even as he trimmed the reach of their tools. He left no sharp edge for pride to catch on, only the smooth grain of clarity. The crowd's shoulders changed shape. Some disappointment escaped through tired exhalations. Some relief arrived disguised as indifference. A few people glanced at their phones, finding other tasks now that the ending failed to produce a scene worth posting. Karen held very still, binder lowering a few inches as if its weight had doubled. The officer's stance softened into the clean readiness that follows good work. The sheriff let the explanation stand without additive. The lesson had to belong to the roan, not to him, or it would fail as soon as the lights left the birch trunks. And yet the public challenge was not quite done. A final wave remained, the human tendency to seek restitution when righteousness loses its footing. A neighbor asked whether fines would be levied for the time of officers and the disruption. Another suggested that if the rules did not apply here, perhaps they applied nowhere. A false cliff offered to anyone still needing a thrill. The deputy parried gently, reminding the circle, through the language of jurisdiction and the courtesy of tone, that calls to emergency lines must be reserved for emergencies, that civil disagreements have other venues, that community is harmed when theater rents the stage built for triage. The words did their work. They did not bruise. They did not bow. They held. The county for a moment felt like a place choosing adulthood over appetite. Phones lowered. The Lakehummer speaker found no audience and turned back up the lane. The HOA sign lost its tension and lay flat in the grass. No longer a metronome, but a reminder of how quickly cardboard surrenders to gravity. The sheriff stayed quiet and let the last inch of air leave the moment. He felt the edges of the revelation waiting, not necessary to the legality, yet essential to the story the crowd would carry away. He measured its utility against its risk. Done wrong, it would salt the ground. Done right, it would teach without shaming, inoculating the neighborhood against future escalations by setting a gentle precedent. Know the full shape of a person before you invite an audience to watch them diminished. The deputy closed the deed, slid the survey back into its envelope and returned it to the rail without flourish. He turned slightly, as if hearing something private in his earpiece. Though everyone could see, the radio was quiet. The look he shared with the sheriff was small and professional. A recognition of shared craft and of the next beat that would land with the least harm. The afternoon stood on that breathless rim where endings become beginnings if someone opens the right door. The lake answered first, lifting a small clap against the pilings. The porch boards answered next, remembering the weight of the man who had kept this place and this county steady. Then the moment answered, a clean, calm opening in which the truth could step through without knocking anything over. The public challenge, crested and receding, left behind a shore smoothed enough to receive what came next. The deputy's explanation had done most of the lifting. Jurisdiction had been mapped, timelines set in their proper order, and the amendments reduced to their right size beside older rights that did not move when newer paper asked them to. The crowd, starved of a spectacle, began to trade posture for posture's quieter cousin, comprehension. What remained was the formal work that finishes any call, names, dates, identifiers, the careful seams that keep a report from fraying when memory is tempted to edit. The deputy turned from the circle to the porch and asked for identification in the same even cadence he had used all afternoon. The request was neither challenge nor concession. It was the ordinary act that anchors a scene in fact. The sheriff reached into the porch drawer, not for theater but for completion, and produced the same slim wallet that had ridden with him through a decade of ruin and repair. The badge lay inside its leather like a coin that had changed hands honestly and often. He set it where the deputy could see it, not on display for the crowd, but in the open enough that secrecy would not become its own performance. Light found the metal briefly and then moved on. Recognition traveled the short distance between two professionals. First, a small nod that said the paperwork would now reflect the plain truth of who had been standing on the cedar boards throughout. The deputy's stance eased, not into deference, but into that right-sized confidence that arrives when craft and context line up. He recorded the identification number and the name he already knew. He did not raise his voice. He did not turn to the crowd. He simply did the task as if the badge were any citizen's credential, because on that porch it was exactly that. The revelation, such as it was, spread outward without announcement. It moved along the whisper paths that communities use to update their understanding. A neighbor who stood close enough to see the glint adjusted his jaw, the movement of someone re-shelving a story on a different aisle. The bait shop owner's mouth softened around something like a relieved grin he did not show. The boy on the bicycle tipped forward on his pedals and then steadied himself again, filing away a new rule about appearances and authority. The latecomer with the portable speaker read the air correctly at last, and let himself become background. Karen felt it differently. The binder shifted against her chest as if its weight had gone up while the paper stayed the same. She had not planned for a twist that did not bend to her design, one in which the man she had recruited an audience to diminish turned out to be the person this county trusted with its worst moments. Her shoulders carried the calculation, a scramble for meaning that would protect pride without cracking it. In a different place, the revelation would have been used to humiliate her. On this shoreline it arrived as a boundary with a handrail. The deputy closed the notebook and faced the circle. One last time. He summarized briefly what the documents and statutes required. He reminded everyone that emergency lines exist for danger, not for disputes about dock lengths and siding. He pointed them toward the civil channels available for any future disagreements that rose to that level, and toward the HOA's own process for amending overreach when good intention outruns authority. He left no splinters. He declined to turn the badge on the porch into leverage. He allowed the moment to be as instructional as it needed to be, and no more. The sheriff did not step forward to add weight. He stayed where he had stood since the first folding chair opened, letting the afternoon carry its own conclusion. He had learned that authority is felt most cleanly when it does not need to insist. The county's lesson would be more durable if it belonged to the deputy's voice and the paper's dates. The badge on the rail was only a footnote that taught a quieter thing, that assumptions are brittle, that spectacle is a poor investigator, that certainty should always leave room at the table for context. Reactions arranged themselves in the ordinary human spectrum. A few faces tightened around the discomfort of being wrong in public, even gently. A few relaxed into the relief of a resolution that did not make enemies out of neighbors. Some simply looked tired, the most honest posture of any crowd that expected catharsis and found process instead. The HOA sign, loosened from its stake by the steady push of lake air and the passing of its usefulness, lay flat on the grass, as undecorative as cardboard always becomes when the show is over. Karen didn't leave quickly. She hovered near the deputy with a face that had traded combat for complex arithmetic. She asked procedural questions without drama, trying to parse a path between saving face and respecting the boundary just laid. The deputy answered without theater, granting her the dignity of being treated as a citizen worried about order rather than an antagonist to be vanquished. She tucked the answers into the binder that had served as shield and script, and for the first time since the crowd gathered, she looked at the lake rather than at the porch. Neighbors thinned in ones and twos the way they do after a storm. Mrs. Afield. The girl with the beagle led her dog back up the lane with the careful pride of someone who has just seen adults choose a useful kind of restraint. The boy on the bicycle rode circles at the edge of the gravel and then slipped away, a new story spinning in the wheel of his head about what power looks like and the better ways it can be used. The bait shop owner stayed long enough to exchange the smallest of nods with the porch, the kind of currency that never needs a receipt. The deputy returned the documents with a final clean motion. The envelope went back to the rail, then to the drawer, then to the dark, where important things rest until they are needed again. Radio traffic tugged the officer's attention toward other corners of the county, places where the stage is a ditch or a kitchen or a dim hallway, and the audience is pain rather than opinion. They left as they had come, with the hum of tires reminding the lane that service continues even when the show has ended. The porch reclaimed its ordinary sounds. A board answering a shift in weight, a bird trying out a phrase from a different tree, the light skittering on water as if it had shed a layer of seriousness. The sheriff stood alone and took stock. The knot of spectacle had been untied without cutting the rope. The revelation had landed as information, not as cudgel. The community had been asked to be better without being told it was bad. Not every day allows for endings like that. He let gratitude have the last word inside his ribs before moving. Only then did he step off the porch and collect the fallen sign. He straightened its bent edge, an unremarkable act that pushed the afternoon 1 inch further toward repair. He set it beside the birch where it would wait to be carried away by the same hands that had planted it. He did not leave a mark or a note. He did not polish the moment. He simply made it ready for someone else to finish without shame. Evening began to stretch long across the water. The dock, the same length it had been on the day it was first measured against storms, rather than meetings, took on the color of pewter and kept its place. The house exhaled, the way houses do when their people keep them safe by refusing to make them stages. The lake practiced its old grammar again, smoothing everything that had scraped against it. The deputy's careful words and the badge's quiet gleam drifted inward and downward until they became part of the county's sediment, the layer that holds when later weather tries to move it. The unexpected revelation had not changed who anyone was. It had changed how the afternoon understood itself. That was enough. The sheriff stepped back inside, not victorious, not vindicated, but readied for the less visible work that would now follow. Meetings held without lights, forms revised in plain language, A small shift in how a phone number lives in a refrigerator magnet's corner. The real outcomes, like tides, would be slow, and by the time they were obvious, the memory of a crowd on a lawn would have faded into a gentler story. People told about a day when a lake taught a neighborhood what to do with its certainty. In the days that followed, resolution traveled along practical routes. The county dispatch supervisor drafted a memo that would live near every console and in the training slides for new hires. A simple, firm reminder that emergency lines are triage lanes, not conduits for disputes about appearances. The memo did not name neighborhoods or people. It used scenarios and clear forks in decision trees. It asked call takers to practice the sentence that redirects without shaming. And it offered numbers for civil channels that exist precisely so uniforms don't have to stand where neighbors should. The HOA board met in a room that always smelled faintly of copier toner and brewed coffee. Attendance was higher than usual and quieter, the way rooms get when everyone carries the same recent memory. Karen came early with her binder, though its spine no longer seemed like armor. She stacked it on the table and folded her hands on top as if to keep them still. The agenda included landscaping and dues, and a note about the goose problem at the South Cove. It also included near the bottom a line about clarifying the association's authority relative to pre-existing structures and recorded easements. When that line arrived, discussion moved carefully. A member who had nodded along to every hard edge in prior meetings now spoke about the relief of knowing the lake held older truths than any single board's appetite. Another who had avoided conflict before now risked a practical suggestion about bringing in a county planner to brief the board on limits and best practices. Karen read from her notes less and listened more. She recommended, with a steadiness that surprised some of her allies and pleased some of her critics, a small committee tasked with rewriting the guidance in plainer language that would reduce the temptation to use sharp tools for soft problems. The motion carried. No one applaud. Grown-up rooms rarely do when they choose the right thing, because the right thing lands like maintenance rather than victory. Elsewhere around the lake, quieter changes took root. The bait shop owner taped a printed strip near the register that listed non-emergency numbers beneath a hand-drawn line that read, in his thick block letters, for when it's not about danger, it's about neighbors. A retired teacher began hosting Saturday mornings on her dock, inviting anyone with a complaint to bring it to coffee before bringing it to committee. The gatherings produced more muffins than rulings and more borrowed tools than citations. The lake noticed the difference first, because the lake counts peace in the number of evenings it can mirror undisturbed. Karen walked her route more slowly. She still picked up litter with the deliberate precision that had always been her burst use of intensity. She still measured sight lines in her head and imagined what could be tidier. But the day at the porch lingered in her like a pebble that rebalanced her step. She began to ask quietly and without needing to be seen about ways to serve that did not involve a microphone. She signed up for a shoreline planting project that replaced eroding grass with native reeds. She made cookies that were too crisp at the edges and left them on a doorstep that had frustrated her for months. Precision can become kindness when it loosens its grip. The deputy returned to work with a report that read cleaner than most, and with a private confidence burnished by the way the afternoon had concluded. He carried that steadiness into calls that deserved it more, a kitchen where anger needed redirecting into safety, a bridge where a teenager had decided to test the dark, a field where new trouble tried to borrow old grudges. He told a new class of recruits about the call at the lake, not as a story about a sheriff's house, but as a lesson in how to stage truth without dramatizing it. He told them that law is a spine, not a show, and that dignity is both a tactic and a gift. The boy on the bicycle rode differently around property lines. He still tested speed on the downslopes, but he also learned where to dismount and why. He repeated a sentence at home about how grown-ups had chosen sense over drama, and it passed along the small structure children rely on when they fit their own edges to a place. The girl with the beagle began waving at the porch when she passed. A shy, unrequired habit that warmed the house in a way unconnected to the thermostats. For the sheriff, resolution looked like chores. He resealed the tops of the porch rails on a mild evening when the lake lay flat and the sky kept its opinions to itself. He inventoried the workshop and finally rehung the heavier mallet on its proper hook. He oiled the hinges on the boathouse and noted the small rot starting at the back corner, a problem solved by attention rather than rules. He wrote a brief note to the HOA address, acknowledging the board's vote to clarify authority, and he sent a separate, smaller note thanking the deputy by name for craft well practiced. None of it needed an audience. Moral impact revealed itself in absence as much as in action. There were no more folding chairs set up at the edge of someone else's lawn to frame a performance. There were fewer phones held chest high to gather evidence for a narrative already written in the holder's head. There were new rhythms instead. Borrowed ladders returned with a thank you written on a sticky note, text threads about weather warnings rather than infractions, a shared spreadsheet for tool lending that saved the board from inventing policies to solve problems solved better by familiarity. The badge stayed where it belonged, inside the wallet, inside the drawer, inside a job that had enough heavy hours without being invited to decorate light ones. The house kept its long habits. Mornings began with the light that arrives across water like a lesson in patience. Evenings closed with the clink of ice and the porch's old conversation between cedars and wind. The sheriff resumed the practice that made the lake a refuge rather than a statement. Running the lane before sunrise, fixing what broke, answering what required him, declining what only needed neighborliness. If there was a single lesson anyone could name without reaching for sentiment, it was this: belonging works better than control. The county did not become perfect. It did, for a while, become clearer about the difference between urgent and merely agitated, between authority and audience, between the tidy sensation of enforcing something and the quieter, heavier work of tending to it. The HOA's revised guidance began with a sentence that would have seemed too humble a year earlier. Older rights deserve respect, and new rules should be instruments of care, not instruments of spectacle. Underneath, in smaller type, sat the phone number for the non-emergency line and a reminder that most neighbor problems travel better over porches than over radios. One late afternoon in early fall, the sheriff pulled the canoe from its pegs and set it on the water without any sense that he was making a point. The lake received the hull in its old benevolent way, smoothing the slight disruption into regular motion. He paddled past the edge of his dock and then farther, low strokes that stitched the margins of small coves back into a hole. The houses watched from behind their glass. The geese drew their black commas again. The shoreline demonstrated how to hold firm without pretending to be a wall. He drifted a while and then turned home as the light went to copper. On the porch above the place where the badge had glinted for a breath and then gone back being simple identification, the evening gathered itself. Somewhere up the lane, laughter broke from a yard and didn't cut anything. As it traveled, the bait shop owner hosed his stoop and let the water find the drain at its own pace. The deputy, off shift, carried groceries into an apartment that did not know how to be impressed and did not need to. Karen walked a new route that included the South Cove reeds, and her binder stayed home on a shelf that had room now for other things. The lake made again its old promise, offered not in words, but in the shape of its surface, and the patience of its sound, that most conflicts soften if given a place to land that isn't a stage, that most rules work better when they admit what they cannot do, that most people, when offered a bridge instead of a cliff, will cross without being told they were falling. The county took the promise the way stewards do, without drama, with practice, with gratitude that rarely announces itself. The house breathed with the night, and with the knowledge that it had not been turned into a lesson against its will. It had simply continued, held by the hands that built it, and the hands that kept it, and the water that kept forgiving what scraped it. In the ledger that matters, the afternoon of lights and binders and certainty had left a balance that favored adulthood. The moral did not need engraving to hold. It lived instead in the unremarkable return of ordinary, in porches used for sitting, in docks used for tying up boats, in a phone number dialed only when something is truly wrong, and in a badge that is strongest when it lets a place teach before it speaks.